Yeah, and just to add, while there is absolutely an immediacy to that issue, because services like our own are and has adequate consultation services, so the lens of.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you all for appearing before the committee today. I think your insight into the immigration systems and the experience of migrants is invaluable for us. The state's approach to immigration is much more complicated and I think even more draconian than the average person realises. So I can only hope that your work and this committee can help draw attention to those issues, which I think the ministers and departments can resolve fairly easily. The first question I have, and it's kind of to follow on from Brian's response to Deputy Batchik, but for both Cross-Care Information and Advocacy Services and the Immigrant Council for Ireland, I'm wondering, a few weeks ago, the Migrant Rights Centre explained how aspects of our immigration system were leaving individuals and children vulnerable to domestic violence and coercion, that the way the system is set up sort of facilitates it. And I know the Immigrant Council of Ireland has an online discussion on the issue on Thursday, and Cross-Care mentioned it in your statement as well. So I'm wondering just if you could both outline for the committee some of the concerns that you have in this area. And then, Chair, I'm just going to give a few questions, and if there's time, that would be great. And if not, a written response would be great. But first of all, for Bríd and Noel, you mentioned the Department of Social Protection Services and Supports need to be kind of more sensitised to migrant vulnerabilities. I'm wondering if you could just elaborate on what this would involve and the importance of the changes. And also your statement had a very worrying sentence in relation to individuals and families needing housing and homelessness supports. I just quote, it was migrants have the additional layer of immigration residency permission that can limit their ability to access social services. Could you just explain kind of the implications of that situation and what could be done to improve conditions for migrants? And then for the Immigrant Council of Ireland, for Brian, you highlighted the kind of overly bureaucratic and paper-based nature of many of the immigration processes, the weakness of which were, I think, emphasised during the pandemic and the restrictions. I was just wondering if you could elaborate on the kind of bureaucracies involved and reforms the Department of Justice could implement to kind of help resolve the situation as soon as possible. Thank you, Chair.
I guess we'll start with Cross-Care there. Noel, do you want to come in on those housing and habitual residency questions?
Sure, thank you, Deputy. Yes, this is very important because as part of the sensitivity to things that, and the interpreters, obviously, service is an intrinsic part of this so that people can communicate. And firstly, but secondly, in terms of the sensitivity to things that officials will see that treating people the same is not treating them equally. So that you have to be sensitised to the vulnerability and be open to assessment. In the migrant integration strategy, the department committed itself to providing information on rights and entitlements now, and to be particularly to migrant households presenting. And that means in order to have that engagement, you have to be exploring the issue with the person. So I think that's a very important thing for us. That officials need to be supported, to explore the issues and why people are there. And because then when they know that, they can act accordingly and link them to services that they will need. So I think there's a structural issue and there's a to support people in their humanity. I suppose that they are officials, but they're human beings dealing with other human beings, and it is the Department of Social Protection. And the same extends to the Housing Authority. So I think that's why training and cultural awareness, training and sensitivity for things like identifying the possibility of domestic violence, of coercive control, of identifying vulnerabilities in people and how they communicate with you are absolutely critical to the quality of engagement that officials will have, and in their own way to be able to help people, because that's why they're there and that's why they stay there. So I think if that's in a nutshell, that's what I would say. And there is also the underpinning thing that in terms of sensitivity, it comes also to knowledge and competency around rights and entitlements, that when somebody walks in who's just lost their job and has particular characteristics, that they know, well, yes, I understand the situation that this person's in, and I understand this is the kind of information I need to give them, or this is the kind of pathway that they need to know about. So I think that's very important as well, because it does happen this person's in, and I understand this is the kind of information I need to give them, or this is the kind of pathway that they need to know about. So I think that's very important as well, because it does happen often, unfortunately, simple things, that people get the wrong information and get the wrong advice and they get the wrong forms, and that's a real problem, because then you're off heading in the wrong direction, and you could be in a very precarious situation. So it's sensitizing them to hearing the person, hearing the issues, and sensitizing them to the pathways that they need to know about and need to impart information on. So I think that's a really important point. I think, like in the housing side you asked, it is very worrying. Because whilst, for example, there is a circular from the department around local authorities interacting with victims of domestic violence, I remember it was pointed out to me one local authority, well, that's just a circular. We don't have to help them. And it's chilling, and it's not said in an uncaring, inhumane way. It's said from the point of view of, well, we work within a structure. So it's that the structure needs to leave the space for people to respond correctly, to respond appropriately, even rather than correctly, let's say appropriately. So that can be a problem. And in terms of a simple example, in terms of where this can happen for immigration, we would have cases where you would have someone who maybe is undocumented. Obviously, some of those cases now will be very welcome, covered by the latest developments, or who has a particular immigration permission, where they will get the wrong advice from, say, a homeless section local authority. They'll be said, you need to go back to reception integration if they're a student, for example, where reception integration have no role in their case. There's confusion about what should they be doing, where in fact what we were saying was that when someone presents to a homeless section of the local authority, it's covered by Section 2 of the Act. The definition of homelessness is very clear in primary legislation. Apply it and facilitate people to apply it in the humanity with which in fairness, the legislation reflects. And I think that's really, they're the kind of things that we would very strongly encourage, and it would have the benefit that people wouldn't fall off a cliff and they wouldn't be exposed to further exploitation, which is often what happens then. A friend will help them fill out the forms, a friend will help them interpret, and these friends are often not necessarily good actors, and they risks of identity theft, for example. We've seen that, getting held for the PPS number, online application, people's identity gets stolen. So these are the kind of things that are the consequences and can be avoided by proper deployment of services in an accessible way. Hopefully that answers your question.
Breege, did you want to come in there? I see your hand up.
I was just going to make one comment, Deputy, around domestic violence. Women are so many weeks in a domestic violence shelter. If they do not have an up-to-date IRP card, they can't go on the social housing list. So, and I think sometimes when we have examples of a woman who was in a domestic shelter, ended up in homeless accommodation, and she was told she had only 3 nights. And this is all about information and understanding. And I said, no, they won't throw you out with your 3 children. So the first night she rang me, the second night she rang me. On the third night she rang our day and she said, Breege, I have to be out tomorrow. What am I going to do? And I said, no, they will not throw you out. And in the background, her little 6-year-old was saying, please, Mammy, please don't cry. Please don't cry. So I had to reassure. So I asked her, this is on the phone. I asked her, could I speak to her little daughter? So I spent a half an hour talking to the 3 of them together. She's 2 other children, explaining, yes, the local authority will accommodate you in a longer time homeless accommodation. That's what we are working with, because people haven't been told exactly what's going to happen. We're talking about people's lives. We're talking about a woman that had suffered quite a lot as it was, and her children witnessing this. And this is what we're trying to follow up. So, and this is where legislation and the rights and entitlements that Noel said there, that some people are not aware of. And it's just humanity. It's just simple saying, look, you will be here for these 3 nights. After that, look, we will get you another accommodation to live in. Thank you.
Thanks. Brian, I see your hand up as well. Do you want to come in there?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I suppose just to follow on from the points which Noel and Breach made in relation to domestic violence circumstances, which we totally would concur with. I suppose there's a couple of other elements that I'd like to highlight as well. And one, I suppose, is that a lot of the issues that emanate in this area come from the fact that because our immigration system essentially ties one person's status to another in instances of family reunification. So you'll have, in the vast majority of cases, the man whose immigration status is the primary migrant, in inverted commas, maybe on a work permit or some type of immigration status. Their partner joins them as a dependent spouse under stamp 3 conditions, but that their right to remain in the state is contingent on their continuing relationship, essentially. So when relationships break down because of domestic violence, that puts the spouse's right to remain in the state in question. Now, so this is not only an issue of a lack of clarity then as regards their continued residency in the state, but it's also an element of control. It's used as an element of control by abusive partners. If you go to the police, if you go to immigration, they'll deport you. Your status is you're only here because you're in a relationship with me. Essentially, is what is used as an element of coercion. So organisations like ourselves have worked down through the years in support of migrant women, primarily not exclusively, but primarily in domestic violence circumstances, to convince them essentially that you have to get out of the situation you're in for your own safety, and then you can approach the minister, and at the minister's discretion you may be granted a status to remain in the state. Now, 99% of the time that application is successful from the Department of Justice, and we have to commend them in those circumstances, that in the vast majority of circumstances they do issue an independent status to as somebody who's in a domestic violence circumstance. But generally that information is not publicly known. You would have to dig and dig on the Department of Justice website to find a little information note that talks about independent status for victims of domestic violence. And again, it's not a piece of legislation, not really necessarily a statutory instrument or an official piece of policy. It's an information note on the website. So there's a huge amount of missed opportunities, I suppose, in supporting somebody, because they may come to an organisation like ourselves and get that support and get their hand held essentially to go through that process. But how many aren't? And look at the difference between, say, for example, those that come to our services and how many people are ringing the Women's Aid National Helpline that are migrant women as well. And that's an even bigger number again than are accessing our services. So there's a huge gap there. As you rightly said, Deputy Cairns, and thanks for mentioning it, we have an information session on Thursday this week around the We Are Here Too campaign, which is migrant women led, which is essentially around trying to bridge the gap between marginalised migrant women and domestic violence services that are out there. So there's a lot of good work going on in that area, but a huge need to really clarify it. We've had instances just like Breach has mentioned, where somebody goes into a community welfare officer, they're on a stamp 3, they have 2 small kids, the partner has left having been domestically abusive, and the community welfare officer says, oh, you're on stamp 3, you're not entitled to any payments, you don't get anything. And we would have to write a letter that, I would describe it as a letter that would take the paint off the wall, essentially, to get that person some kind of emergency support in the immediate term. But that shouldn't have to happen. It shouldn't take the intervention of an organisation to come in and kicking and screaming essentially to get a payment for somebody. And that's not, again, to say that that's all community welfare officers is not. There's a lot of great work being done out there in the community as well. But it's that inconsistency that is massively problematic. I don't know if I have time to answer the second bit, Chair, about bureaucracy and things like that. So I'll I keep talking.
I may just come back to that, because I just have, we're kind of reached the end of time of that, and I just want to ask 1 or 2 questions in my own right, and then I think we can do another round, and we'll start with maybe that issue.